Do you have the little clicker there? Here you go. All right. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Keith Dimoff. I'm the Executive Director at the Ohio Environmental Council. This works there. A little bit about us. We are an advocacy group. We don't do candidate endorsements or have a PAC, but we do lobby. We do take positions. We are an environmental advocacy group with about 3,000 individual members, about 100 group members around the state. Some of those local citizens and group members certainly been talking with us about fracking in their communities, and I'm going to share some of their concerns with you as we go through this. We also have a law center. We have 3 staff attorneys. We do things like appeal permits or file Clean Water Act lawsuits, so things get involved in the Public Utilities Commission on energy rate cases to try to get energy efficiency built into what the big utilities do and things like that as well. Most of you know, I think, the basics of this issue of the high volume, horizontal hydraulic fracturing. The point here about it being unconventional is a lot of presentations I've seen by oil and gas industry has made the point that fracking is nothing new. Now, the term fracking is, and that particular term is nothing new. But what is really happening in the public discourse today is fracking is shorthand for really reaching the shale gas, the Marcellus and Utica, maybe eventually the Ohio shale formations in Ohio. And a lot of what is driving legitimately the environmental concerns on this front is that it is not old-style conventional vertical oil and gas drilling. This are techniques that involve more water in the fracturing, more chemical additives to the fracturing fluid, more air emissions with a higher density of wells and large numbers of wells, and with the flowback water, more toxic waste and wastewater to be disposed of or dealt with somehow, along with community impacts which have environmental impacts like roads and truck traffic. 2 important things, I think, in terms of what we know about fracking, and are important to know and know better, in my view, if we're going to be able to say at some point, this is good public policy to move forward. One of them is the US EPA will be issuing reports in 2012 and 2014 on the effects of fracking on drinking water. There's also US Secretary of Energy's advisory board on shale. This quote is pulled from their 90-day report, which does importantly say that even if you have individual drilling operations that are in compliance with the regulations, that the impact of all of the scale of the shale gas drilling that Ohio could be on the cusp of can overwhelm ecosystems and communities. My organization and several other organizations have called for a moratorium on fracking unless and until it's demonstrated to be safe for the environment and human health and regulated. And I'll talk a little bit more about the reasons that we have called for that. But a lot of it is, when you look at the scale of this, you look at the potential negative impacts environmentally to the state of Ohio. And, this shale isn't going anywhere. It is there. Ohio has a legacy from other resource extraction, like the coal industry, that paints some pretty painful lessons for plunging headlong into new resource extraction. A few facts, and I have a lot of slides I'm going to try to go through rather quickly. I'm happy at the end when we have Q&A to go back to anything. But the amount of water used in these operations is significant. There's a number of chemical additives, including a number of proprietary chemical mixtures that are used as the shale gas is fractured and ultimately held open for the gas to be extracted. Sometimes you will hear the oil and gas industry say, well, these chemicals are only 1% of the fracking fluid. And I think just as a scientist, actually I'm an engineer, graduate of the Ohio State College of Engineering, sitting up here, civil engineering. You need to think that's 1% of what, and when you're talking about the large volumes of fluids that are being used in this extraction, it adds up to a lot of chemicals. And we know from various reports, including this particular report from the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce, excuse me, that there's a number of these chemicals that are listed as hazardous air pollutants, have other sort of carcinogenic or otherwise toxic attributes. Diesel fuel is another additive that's sometimes used by some of the drilling operations. So it's a real long list of chemicals that are used in this fracturing process. And as part of the process, there is flowback wastewater that needs to be dealt with somehow if the fracking is done. Can it be recycled, and how much of it can be recycled? As in closed-loop systems. Is it going to surface water, wastewater treatment plants? In the state of Ohio, there is only one that's permitted, and no further ones expected to be permitted. The state of Ohio is gearing towards what are called underground injection control wells, basically deep wells for it to go back into the earth. I'll throw in one aside that we're also set up to accept a lot of this fracking wastewater from the state of Pennsylvania. There is a myth out there that the state of Pennsylvania's geology cannot support these wells the way that Ohio's geology can support these wells. And have had a number of geologists and regulators at US EPA Region 5, or excuse me, US EPA Region 3 that oversees Pennsylvania say that that's simply not the case, but we're due to be receiving large volumes of wastewater from out-of-state fracking operations right now. And there are open pits and lots of potential for spills in addition to the trucking then of the wastewater if it's going to a deep well or wherever it's headed off to. This flowback water has some of the chemicals that are added to the fracking liquid. There are other minerals and salts, naturally occurring radioactive materials that are also present in the flowback water. We have, these are industrial operations. There are a number of separators and other sorts of holding tanks with opportunities for fugitive air emissions, which are leaks or relief valves and other sort of unintended releases, along with the flaring and the vehicles and the other sort of production that occur on these pads. And this picture gives you a feel for some of this has to do with the technology of being able to go drill down and then horizontally, but we have these drill pads often have multiple wellheads on the same drill pad. So these are sometimes very, surprisingly, we are hearing from some local community groups. Some landowners have sold mineral rights. There's wells being drilled, and some of the owners and their neighbors are quite surprised at the scale of these operations because they've historically thought, Ohio does have an oil and gas industry, and a lot of people grew up with maybe an oil and gas well on their farm or their neighbor's farm, and they're not really expecting this when the shale gas industry moves into their community. Community impacts, there's a wide range of them. truck traffic and truck traffic estimates, again, because of the scale of equipment in and out, are kind of surprisingly large, especially for, well, rural areas. But this is not just, one other point for people to keep in mind, this is not just a rural Ohio phenomenon here. There's a number of these leases that are being purchased in urban areas. A basic point here, there was a revision to Ohio's oil and gas regulations a couple years ago. It was a major modernization. There were actually a lot of good regulations that were included in that. But I do have to point out, I've heard a number of industry spokesmen point to a report called a Stronger report. It's a organization that does state-by-state reviews of the regulatory programs and talk about what high marks Ohio got in that report. But that report does specifically state that additional program changes are needed because of this impending shale gas boom here in Ohio. Two other things I wanted folks to know, the larger sort of political context. Again, my organization, we lobbied out at the State House, and this last budget cycle, state parkland was open to oil and gas drilling over our objections. We also objected to drilling in nature preserves, and that was removed from the budget bill. And that's a good thing, but our state parks are open to oil and gas drilling, and there was a creation of a new leasing board that we have some concerns about the makeup of that board and what kind of oversight they're really going to provide in the interest of the citizens of Ohio. And then going back several years, the legislature had repealed local zoning and other authorities, including local health department authorities over oil and gas drilling in their communities. And that still stands on the books today. So it is now out of the hands of local officials and only in the hands of state government here in the state of Ohio. I have a number of ideas here of things that would improve the regulatory structure. I'm not going to read all of these. Certainly things, some of them seem sort of common sense, like banning of open pits and a reinstatement of local control provisions. Others involve things like what are called green completions at a well. It does require extra equipment and extra separator tanks and so forth. But after that well is first drilled and the initial rush of flowback comes up, there's a lot of drilling mud and other sediment in that mixture that a lot of traditional equipment can't really handle, and there are some ways to have that special equipment on hand and do what are called green completions. And importantly, I think some baseline water quantity and water quality surveys and other public health assessment surveys in the local community are ultimately going to be very important. Again, I can come back to these as we go through this. I want to be respectful of my other panelists' time here. But the last point I want to make here is, I think ultimately maybe the most important one, which is typically oil and gas and coal mining and other resource extraction industry in this country don't reflect the true external costs of that resource extraction. There's human health costs, there are effects to property values. We have a horrible amount of coal mining, abandoned mine lands, cleanup to do, in Ohio as a result of doing this once before. And ultimately, the biggest external cost that's not yet accounted for has to do with greenhouse gases and climate change. So you've got this issue here of, sometimes natural gas is spoken of as a bridge fuel. And natural gas does, if you burn natural gas and compare it to coal, there are less greenhouse gas emissions, there are less primary pollutants. But the important thing to keep in mind is, at this point, we don't have a national or international energy strategy that is going to move us away from fossil fuels. There's some good things that are happening. In the state of Ohio, we have an energy portfolio standard. There's some success stories when it comes to industrial energy efficiency. There's success stories when it comes to solar and wind and biomass. There's some things that are going on that are actually really promising. There's a Bloomberg report from today that for the first time globally, there's been more investment in renewables than in fossil fuel electricity capacity. But ultimately, we're talking about natural gas is a fossil fuel with a greenhouse gas component to it, and it does enter the system, and it does affect our climate change. And ultimately, we're looking at impacts globally. So we're at a bit of a fork in the road here. Are we going down the path of solar and other renewables and energy efficiency, or are we going down the path of fossil fuels because they're cheap for a while? And I've seen industry ads saying, well, we've got 250 years of reserves. And I look at a map like this, and I think about the areas that are blue on that map, and the massive refugee and dislocation and famine that we may see in our lifetimes as a result of the kind of choices that we're faced with here in the state of Ohio today. There's a larger picture and a larger environmental cost that's not yet accounted for through carbon tax or cap and trade or whatever route you want to go on. We're not there yet. So there's a larger environmental impact here beyond just the local air, land, and water impacts, which in themselves are significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Next we have Tim Buckley. He's Associate Professor, College of Public Health, and he is going to address public health aspects of shale energy.
Great, thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think many of my comments are going to largely mirror Keith's comments, so perhaps I can make up some time. And I'd like to congratulate CERC for taking on this topic of the environmental and public health impacts of shale gas mining, which I think is incredibly important and doesn't get the amount of attention and discussion that it should. In today's economic and political climate, I think we have such a strong tendency to run headlong into issues that are going to create revenue and create jobs at the cost of public health. And I think that we as public health professionals need to remind ourselves and our colleagues in related professions about public health and the impact that these activities do have on public health. We need to take those costs into account, those externalities, just as Keith was describing. So, as Jeff mentioned, I'm here at the OSU College of Public Health. I have just a couple of slides that I'd like to go through in summarizing my assessment of what the public health threat is. And this, again, really, I think, largely mirrors what Keith described. I think that we're concerned about the air emissions associated with these types of activities. And in many respects, I think that we can view these kinds of activities as a lesion that occurs, literally and figuratively within our rural communities. And the impacts can be significant, and I would say have largely been unevaluated. But there are certainly indications for concern related to air emissions associated with traffic activities, the increased roadways and the construction associated with these types of sites. The well fracking fluids and the emissions associated with volatile organic compounds, the diesel exhaust associated with the drill rigs and their support, and the noise that's created from these types of operations and their impact on the surrounding community. The water withdrawal is an issue. There's a large amount of water that's used and can be a concern in terms of how that impacts our communities. And then a lot of discussion about the ground and surface water contamination associated with the fracking fluids and the flow back of petroleum and gas radionuclides that are present, and not necessarily under normal operating conditions, but where it really becomes of concern is under kind of accidental conditions. And we know with the frequency with which these activities are occurring that there will be accidents, and there will be errors that result in the release of these fluids both to surface and groundwater. So that has the potential to clearly impact public health. The social impact also, it's not my area of expertise, but certainly there's been some important literature describing socially what happens to these communities when you get a massive influx of these kinds of activities within our communities. So we have a wide range of community concerns with respect to environment and also social, and not to forget the workplace hazards associated with these types of facilities. A whole series of risks that workers will face associated with these types of operations that we need to be cognizant of and take into account as we move forward with these types of operations.